Hello, good evening, everyone. My name's Amanda. I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore in the Rio Grande River Valley of Albuquerque. During this COVID pandemic, we are operating remotely, i.e. from my home office, for virtual events. I have done maybe 65 of these, and they've ranged from being terrific to being fantastic to being awesome. And tonight is going to be wonderful too, because we have back with us Lawrence Millman, who's become a fan of our store, or a friend of our store, hopefully also a fan of our store. We hosted him earlier in the pandemic for his book Fungipedia. And let me tell you, it was fun, very fun. We had a slideshow for that one. We've got some images tonight. And tonight he's going to be talking about his new book, Goodbye Ice, which is poetry. We were just tossing around some ideas for a possible outdoor book tour in the middle of the Arctic-like winter. Maybe we can come up with some ideas for Lawrence for helping him promote this book that doesn't involve him getting hypothermia. We're doing this one here tonight virtually, which is awesome to be able to be safe like this and to introduce our bookstore to people from other parts of the country. We do ship nationally, and we have free shipping this week. So if you wanted to pick up a copy of his book, we would ship that to you for free. Our website is Bookworks without the O's, so that's bkwrks.com. And I will drop a link into the chat so you guys can go check that out. Lots of great books on our website. Okay, we're very, very pleased, like I said, to have Lawrence back with us tonight. He's going to do some reading. And we'll do a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions during the presentation, you can feel free to either drop me a note personally and tell me you have something, or you can just write your question right into the chat. You can also raise your hand when we get to the Q&A, and I can do some sound manipulation on the soundboard. All right, Lawrence is a mycologist in addition to being a poet. He's the author of numerous books, including Our Like Will Not Be There Again, Last Places, Fascinating Fungi of New England, and At the End of the World, and also Fungipedia, which we have on our website. He's done mycological work in places all over the world, including Greenland, Honduras, Iceland, Panama, the Arctic, Bermuda, and his home in Massachusetts. Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us again tonight. We're happy to see you.
I'm delighted to be here, virtually delighted. Thank you all for coming. I see some very familiar faces out there. As you may well know, my most persistent love affair has been with the Arctic. I've been there 40 plus times, but I've never been to Rome, New York, once. There's lots of reasons for this. The Arctic is a place where nature triumphs over human machinations, where there are fewer people and more nature, more dramatic scenes that will fill one's eye without having an 18-wheeler roar by or appear in view. Speaking of which, machination, some of you may know that I have a allergy to anything akin to a machine. And I might read a little poem a bit later about my, what should we say, a GPS. I don't like GPSs at all because I like looking at a natural setting, the landscape, the world around me, rather than looking at a little screen-like devices that says, well, right now you are situated so and such and such a place. Actually, what I'm going to do is read this short poem right now, whilst I have mentioned it. And I wrote this while I was situated near Ferguson Lake, Nunavut, being assaulted by mosquitoes and black flies. And this is dedicated to Pentti Linkola, who is a late Finnish ecologist. Walking the tundra, I don't need a GPS, for I can easily see purple saxifrage and blue harebells, sedge meadows and fell fields, reindeer lichen and willow thickets, Arctic cotton and lemming burrows, glacial erratics and glacial rubble, all of which tell me where I am, and indeed, who I am. A lot of this book, Goodbye Ice, is a celebration of the Arctic landscape. And Jeremiah, its rapid disappearance. I'm going to read you a few examples that are celebratory. And these are all based in certain places. So this is near Ocock, Labrador. The wind huffs and puffs. It bellows and roars, shouts and shrieks, then huffs and puffs again. But it doesn't blow a house down. After all, there aren't any houses here, only boulders. And if you listen closely, very closely, you might hear one of them say, "How about another kiss, dear winds?" Here, Amanda mentioned I'm a mycologist, and as a mycologist, in addition to fungi, I study lichens, which are, of course, in the same kingdom as fungi. And here's a piece called Lichen, dedicated to a friend of mine in Patagonia, not South America, but Patagonia, Arizona, Gail Corey. May the gods of the tundra grant me lichen until I become lichen myself. Let me a rich yellow nitrophlus lichen decorating an Inuit burial cairn. Let me a foliose lichen stitch otherwise naked granite into a tapestry. Let me become a map lichen so I can read my own geography. May those gods grant me lichen, any sort of lichen, and I'll live on sunlight, dust motes, and the occasional drop of water, never complaining, never asking for more. Every 100 years, I'll add an inch or two to my character. A millennium later, I'll still lack all presumption and still grasp the rock of my choice with a full-bodied embrace. And I should mention now, speaking of rocks, that these poems are not in the current tradition of poetry such as a certain individual wrote in order to obtain a Nobel Prize. I'm referring to selfie poems. Selfie poems are ones where one tends to write somewhat ambiguously about one's current relationships. And personally, I don't think a Nobel Prize should go to someone who is engaged in telling the world, well, this didn't work and that didn't work and that. The environment is far more important. So this is on Herschel Island in the Yukon Territory. This is a poem that can't be taught in a walled-off classroom. After all, it doesn't boast a single ambiguity. for a teacher to disentangle. Its meaning is just as clear as the sunlight terrain of this high latitude island. Do not bow to religion or the raging hyenas of capitalism. Bow only to rocks. Bow low to them, for they know how to live. And here is, I suppose you could call this a nature poem. It's dedicated to my Icelandic friend, Dana Zacharias, and we experienced this, what should we call it, this dive bombing together on the island of Grimsey in the north of Iceland. Rising and descending, soaring and dropping, the Arctic terns scream, Kriya, 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 as they dive bomb me. They're protecting their eggs, or so it's commonly assumed. But they perform their winnowing acrobatics, glissandos and pirouettes, bends, bows, and whip-arounds with such elegance. I can't help but think of them as a femme corps de ballet who've emancipated themselves from the ordinary stage and whose eggs matter less to them than their elegant movements. And so when their beaks peck my head, I think of my blood as payment for their choreography. This is near Nassau, West Greenland. At the top of a cliff, painted yellow by sunburst lichen and directly above the blue-green iceberg-dotted sea, with white-capped mountains rising in the distance, rests a wayward heap of stones. An old Inuit burial cairn with a jagged hole near the top. Gaze into this hole, and you'll see a mossy skull, minus a jawbone, and a few random ribs, along with ragged tufts of sealskin leggings, stuck to an otherwise naked femur. Dear reader, you mustn't pity this much stripped person, for he or she has a beautiful view for all eternity. Let me say now that beautiful view is disappearing as a result of what I like to call not climate change, but climate chaos. Climate change almost suggests something modest, change, whereas chaos indicates vehement pendulum swings to one thing or another. Very cold and snowy weather in a place that's not supposed to get it, and warm weather in a place that is. Like, for instance, I happen to have been in Hudson Bay 7 or 8 years ago, and it was about 92 degrees, and kids were throwing off their clothes and jumping into the water. And I saw a mother, an Inuit woman, and I said, you really need to get a lifeguard here. Lifeguard, she said. What's that? So there's a large portion of this book it deals with the warming of the Arctic, and it's warming 3 times faster than the rest of the world. And as it warms, its landscapes darken, which makes them absorb more heat and darken even more, and so on. And it's not just the land that is affected. Goodbye, ice. Good ancient membrane of the Arctic. Goodbye, shimmering companion who speaks and groans and cracks, roars, shrieks, and silences. You're melting into oblivion. And with your passing, the myriad lives you've blessed. Polar bears, seals, and walrus. Amphipods grazing on algae and lipid-rich zooplankton will become homeless forevermore. Here's another poem on more or less the same subject. Near Cambridge Bay in Nunavut. Never in the history of my eyes have I witnessed a monster like this rough beast slouching not toward Bethlehem, but across Victoria Strait and releasing noxious gases into the previously pristine air, as well as dumping tons of raw sewage into the previously pristine water. Oh, the horror, the horror. What kind of beast is this? It's a 13-deck cruise ship called the Crystal Serenity, traversing a Northwest Passage, now so ice-free. Any monster can traverse it. This is dedicated to my friend Paul Kingsnorth. Hey, look, a land bridge, shouted our Paleolithic brethren, pointing at the Bering Strait. But just as they were starting out on their celebrated journey from Siberia to the New World, one of their shamans had a vision of destroyed habitats, unrestrained development, permafrost, methane emissions, and toxic waste everywhere. Stop! We must go back, he cried out to his constituents. But his warning did no good, for humankind can only go forward, never back, never return to the less poisoned past. Now here is a not unrelated poem. The northern permafrost is melting, and out totters Mr. Methane with a quizzical look on his face. Where do I live now, he wonders. He scratches his head, then scratches it again, and comes up with the answer. The answer is indeed up. So flexing the myriad muscles you might expect from such a potent greenhouse gas, and flapping his newborn wings, he rises up, 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 to carouse in the atmosphere with his fellow greenhouse gases. Whereupon the permafrost melts even more, and out totters Mrs. Methane with her kids. I have, however, a poem about a possibly more hopeful future. This is entitled Raven, and it's dedicated to Bernd Heinrich, of course, the world's greatest raven expert. Raven, as I'm sure all of you know, created the world. It wasn't some woolly whiskered gentleman seated on a cloud in the stratosphere who probably should have been put in an old folks home, but Raven himself, a remarkable deity, I have to say. And I refer to him in this fashion. As the brightest of all deities, Raven created the world. Then he created its myriad denizens, bacteria, algae, protozoa, fish, plants, fungi, insects, avians, reptiles, mammals, an activity so tiresome that he nodded off, whereupon a lesser deity named God created a different type of organism, one that raped and pillaged, one that exterminated other species, and one that even exterminated its own species. Raven awoke to an anthropogenic world where God's organism reigned supreme. Who made this two-legged monstrosity? He asked his gray-bearded inferior, to which God proudly replied, I did. And then, well, you can have it, Raven said. And then he flew off to create a better world somewhere far, far away. I just happened upon this one, and I think I'll read it. I really like it enormously, if I may be so immodest to say so. Jan Mayen is an island north of Iceland, east of East Greenland, that has no year-round inhabitants other than a few Norwegian weather persons. And I've been there several times, and I've enjoyed its absolute wildness. And it has a volcano called Beerenberg. And I'm actually going to read another one that I just thought of, which features Beerenberg. This is called Eider Duck, Crossbukta Jan Mayenland. On a frigid, wind-blasted day with volcanic ash coughed up by Beerenberg, coming down like a squall, she sits contentedly on her nest. And with the brownish gray down below her springy chest feathers, she gives her eggs a warmth so exceptional, I can't help but say to her, with only a hint of anthropomorphism, thanks, mother. Here's a piece on Jan Mayen drift logs. And drift logs in the Arctic come almost exclusively from Siberia. They come up seas like the Lena River, big rivers like the Lena River and so on, and get into the Arctic currents and are swept hither and yon until they hit a southward tending current like the East Greenland current, in which case they're brought down southward and end up on the coastline, thus providing traditionally native people with wood, fires for their homes, and indeed sometimes structures for those homes. Again, here's Jan Mayen drift logs. It's dedicated to a mycologist friend named Bob Blanchett. From the sea's catacombs came these de-articulated bones, shuffled by Arctic currents from Siberian rivers to Jan Mayen's distant, treeless shores. Each bone is a log shellacked to a primordial smoothness by the frigid fingers of northern seas. The most recent are a chestnut brown, as yet undone by the high latitude sun, while the oldest have turned a friable gray. And on gray shingle they lie, askew, isolate, or piled high, a graceful sculptural dream to those of us who are just passing by. I should say now that a good many of these poems are my own transcriptions of songs or stories that I collected over the years from Northern indigenous people, writing them down in prose, but somehow in rereading them, they became poetry in my mind, and I thus customized them accordingly. Here is a good example of one of them, which I will find in one moment. I heard this in Similgak, East Greenland, and it was sung, and I translated it and then retranslated it into this particular poem. Give me the moon. I want to play with the moon, cried the little girl. So her parents visited the local Andakok shaman, a man who'd recently turned a missionary into a muskox. But he refused to grab the moon and give it to the little girl. He even refused to grab it when the parents offered him a seal, even when they offered him 2 seals. For what's in the sky should remain in the sky, just as what's on the earth should remain on the earth. By the way, I think not enough missionaries were turned into muskoxen. You know, I would rather have seen a larger muskox population and a smaller missionary one. But unfortunately, it's too late, and a lot of Pentecostal type religions are now reigning supreme in the Arctic. And those religions are telling their constituents that anything before your conversion to the Christian faith was satanic. And many was the person I talked to who was hesitant to provide me with lore because he was afraid that it would come out and be linked to his name, and he would then be regarded as a follower of Satan. And I wrote a poem on it, but I'll simply describe the poem before I go on to another one. Perhaps the best petroglyphs in all the Arctic are an island in Hudson Strait. And, you know, they're 1,000 years or so, and they have lines coming down. There are a number of faces, and they're doubtless shamanic faces, and the lines dripping down the south part of their faces indicate speaking in tongues or speaking shamanically. Shortly after a few of the local Inuit villages converted to Pentecostalism, someone went to the island where the petroglyphs are and found crosses carved over each one of them, thus destroying what is or was an archaeological treasure for all eternity. So I'll now move to something a little bit less, shall we say, fearsome. This is Amasilik, East Greenland. And so a person who has an interest in music might say, well, you can't, if you're going north, too bad, you're not going to hear any concerts. That is not at all true, as this poem indicates. The concert begins. One dog howls a falsetto moan. Another follows with an alto voice. Another with a cavernous bass. Yet another with a high-pitched soprano. And soon the whole village is howling. Some dogs stick to the same key. Some change keys. Some howl plangent octaves. Others rip the air with sforzandos. Some seem to be howling Beethoven. Others, Bela Bartok. Still others, oldies but goodies. And a few even Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Yet each dog's howl, whatever the key or musical style, carries the same message. Let me pull a sled, O human master, let me pull a sled, please, or I'll feel like a Pekingese. Incidentally, in one of my books, Last Places, I described a similar concert, and a chap in the northern Yukon, Helmut Schruner, read it, delighted in it, had a team of sled dogs, recorded it, and sent me the CD of his howling dogs, a slightly different concert, but still a concert. And so I dedicated this piece to Helmut. Now, I am wearing the hat of a mycologist, as you can see. So here's a poem about an Arctic fungus. And I ought to say that every time I head north, somebody will say, oh, too bad, you're going up to the Arctic. No, you're not going to see any mushrooms. That shows a bit of naivete because indeed, the biomass of mushrooms in the Arctic is far, well, it at least equals the biomass in these temperate regions. One of the reasons for this is that all the plants know that fungi save their lives. The underground portion of the plant, the root, connects with the mycelium of the fungus. And in a nitrogen poor soil, the mycelium of that fungus does an infinitely better job at getting nitrogen and providing it to the roots of the plant or tree than those roots themselves would do on their own. All praise the mighty Lexinum, a scaber-stalked mushroom that readily spreads its spores in a habitat so wind-blown and likewise so frigid that if a redwood, seemingly mighty itself, somehow found itself here, it might bawl these words: California, where art thou? Periodically, you might have noticed that I return to the, shall we say, the ill fit of Christianity in the Arctic. And in this piece, which is called Invasive Species, I bring it, I suppose you could say, to the fore. Clad in the paper-thin garb of their sun-dried homeland and craving baba ganoush and falafel, God and his son huddled together in their high-end polyester cotton tent. It's friggin' cold, God declares. A shivering Jesus nods in agreement.
Shipping this week.
They've managed just 2 conversions, a mentally challenged lemming and a recently deceased caribou. Screw this place, proclaims God, to which Jesus says, amen to that, Dad. So they hop onto their private jet and fly back to the Holy Land, whereupon there's a sudden gust of wind, the Arctic sighing with relief. Now, I was on Wrangel Island, which is north of Siberia, and only has a year-round population of about 15, which seems to me, it makes it a highly civilized place. And the fact is that half of those people are scientists and half of them are naturalists looking after the preserve. And there are 1 or 2 border guards. And when I was there and I was taking notes in my notebook, one of the border guards came up to me and said, CIA? And I shook my head and said, no. I said, no, PhD. And he burst into riotous laughter and handed me a bottle of vodka. This is on Wrangel Island. There I was, bent over a heap of polar bear shit, studying its contents. Here were seal whiskers. Here were berry pits. And here was a delicate maze of bird bones. Suddenly, I looked up, and there was a polar bear studying me. You're an advanced species, and this is what you do? Its baffled expression seemed to say. Then it loped away, rejecting me before I could be afraid. This is also from Wrangel Island. And find it. There it rests, a relic of Soviet times, its floor a maze, its walls collapsed, its seat not even a semicircle, the northernmost outhouse in the world. Being in the Guinness Book of Records or appearing on primetime TV, it doesn't give a damn about, for it has no interest in celebrity. It simply wants to return, and return as soon as possible to the earth, its home. And here, while we're on Wrangel Island, let's see, where is it? Well, I had another piece on Wrangel Island, but these are not arranged geographically, so I might wait a few seconds and read it later, and instead read this poem called Snowy Owl, set near Kwamanaktuknak in Nunavut. A flesh and feathers gift of white, whose golden eyes flash like gemstones, flutters down onto a nearby boulder and stares at me for a moment, then utters several low, rasping hoots, which inform me, no offense, good sir, but you're much less important than a lemming. I think one or two more, and then we'll open it to questions. This is Herschel Island again, north of the Yukon. Used to have whalers coming in the early part of the 20th century, and missionaries showed up, ministers, and built a church for the whalers to pray in. Most of them did not engage in prayer. They went after Inuit skirts and got drunk, but they also played baseball. I wrote an article once about entitled Frozen Ropes, indeed, about the fellow named Hudson Bodfish from Martha's Vineyard, who, to keep the whalers from chasing after Inuit or vacating the ship, decided to have baseball. And so Herschel became seen for the northernmost baseball games in the world, played on the ice in the dead of winter, and whaling boats did not have to go back to southern regions and come north again. They overwintered, and then they got a start on hunting bowhead whales, which was the main whale in the vicinity of Herschel Island. Squatting among tussocks of sedge grass rest the dead boards of a church. Collapsed windows, permafrost floor, a few lupins at the door, and a fruiting of rusula mushrooms in the nave. The nearest thing to a crucifix is a rotting pear of crossed boards fallen from the roof. Yet what better place for divine worship? In the decayed rafters sits the congregation, a group of black guillemots. They proclaim their faith by piping high-pitched hymns of praise to the Arctic's gaping solitudes. As I listen to them, I too became devout. Here is this is called Berry Hunting Song. And this is a song that I heard, transposed, changed half a dozen words, and it became this poem, heard in Similagak, East Greenland. Where can I find berries? Who can I ask? Not a raven, not a reindeer, and certainly not a polar bear, but a little lemming, a smart little lemming. Just follow me, he'll say. We'll go up that hillside and I'll show you berries, all the berries you want, berries so dew fresh and so sweet, only a lemming can find them. Here's a story I heard that I transposed into a poem, and it will be the last one I read. And I heard this in Repulse Bay, wrote it down as prose, remembered it, and turned it into poetry. There was once an Inuk who had no friends, not even a single one. One day he went for a walk and he sank in some moss, sank deeper and deeper until he disappeared. I'm comfortable down here, he said. And he remained in the moss until he became moss himself. Now he had friends all around him. Thank you very much. And we can now open it to Q&A.
Thank you, Lawrence. That was lovely. We have a first question coming in from David. Hello, David. He says, hello, Larry. Having read many of your prose works and your poetry, I wonder what these different forms give to you as a writer. Apart from length, why would you choose poetry over prose? Hi, David. Thank you for your question.
Sure.
Hi, David. Thank you for your question. Good to see you. Why did I choose poetry over prose? Because it's a difficult question. I thought I could be more terse and could reach more readers than I reached when I was writing my prose books. A lot of these were inspired by poems, songs, and chants by Indigenous people. And ultimately, my muse decided, and she's the one who makes these decisions, and I simply have to follow her whims. I don't know how this came about, but it seemed to come out of the ether and appear. I often describe myself when talking about this book saying, I'm not a poet. So I'm now going to be reading from my book of poetry. And I guess I should say that I'm not a poet in the sense that poetry is now known. I'm not a poet who would deign to publish in the upscale urban pages of the New Yorker. But rather, I'm a poet in the sense that Walt Whitman or Robinson Jeffers or Robert Service, one of my absolute favorites. You know who he is. The Cremation of Dan McGee. It's a poem that, by the way, had a lot of attention. Service's poem, and it became a popular source of tourism in the Yukon. So much so that in 1937, 34 years after the poem was published, the actual model for Dan McGee came to Dawson City, and someone tried to sell him an urn full of his own ashes. Now, how often does that happen?
It's never happened to me. Thank you.
And I hope it doesn't.
Lawrence, where do you do your writing? Do you write these poems while you're out in nature, or do you look back on some of your recollections and photos to get inspiration? How does that usually work for you with
poetry? I write a lot of them out of doors, and I find that words flow more readily when I'm out of doors, regardless of what the weather is like, unless it's extremely hot, in which case my muse melts. But I can sit in my garden in Cambridge and write things, or I can be on my travels, or I can be sitting on a log out in the woods, recovering from looking for mushrooms for the last 3 hours or so. So, and I'll write some of them indoors as well.
Okay, does anyone else have a question? If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you, or you can type it into the chat. How was it to work on this book compared to Fungipedia as far as your time commitment and just the production of it?
Well, Fungipedia was, I wouldn't say more of a burden, but it required a little more background research because I was researching a lot of aspects of fungi that I knew something about, but not enough about to have the entry qualify as an entry in Fungipedia. So I had to do a little bit of computer research, and also especially research in the Farlow Herbarium at Harvard, which has a lot of very old books on mushrooms. And I took advantage of that. Alas, I can't go there now, nor can anyone else, because it's closed to the public due to something that, by the way, this is my third Zoom in the last 4 days, and I'm starting to refer to the current situation as COVID-19. You know, some of my friends, I have a friend who's a teacher, and he's on his computer, well, I wouldn't say 24/7, but I'm afraid he may start confusing his microwave with the computer, and is trying to see his students via the microwave, because this can become a very, very tiresome activity.
Yes, I agree. We're not exactly living in a Zoomtopia here, but at least we have it.
Right, exactly.
How is your writing going during the pandemic, and what are you up to given the closures and everything?
Oh, my writing is going very well during the pandemic. You know, I have to say, though, that it went very well before the pandemic, you know, because essentially I'm a writer, and, you know, I don't necessarily have to go to this world 9 to 5, commuting back and forth, you know, which strikes me as the strangest migration in the history of the planet. But it's going quite well. I'm working on what we would call a personal memoir, describing myself as an outsider, i.e. someone who prefers the outside to the inside, and someone who is an outsider in the sense that he doesn't engage in too much social activity. I start out by talking a bit about social distancing, and indicate that, in fact, I've always engaged in it. woman friend of mine saw my mother some years ago and asked her what I was like as a kid. And my mother said, well, he hated crowds. And then she added, and for him, a crowd was anything more than one person.
All right. Well, I'm glad you're finding some benefit to the social distancing. I agree. I'm an introvert as well, so I don't mind being at home all that much. All right.
Here's
Anna
a-
Wexler.
Yeah, go ahead.
Anna Wexler, she says, hi, Larry. What's it like for a travel writer not being able to travel in the age of COVID?
Anna, in the last few years, I really haven't been a travel writer that much. All the magazines and publications I wrote for have either gone belly up or become digital. And I refuse to write for digital publications. I want to see my words in print in some place other than on a screen. I regard the screen that I'm now looking at as simply a piece of furniture. So I like hard copy. I like, something I've written. I like to be able to spill coffee on it. And I mean, what I could do now, where Amanda's smiling at me, it's gotten quite cold, by the way, a cup of coffee, and I could splash her with it, but I'd rather not do that. So no, I haven't, but what has been affected is my traveling. I was supposed to go to Europe to give a talk at the Uzi Museum in northern Italy. Uzi, you know who that gentleman was. The Tyrolean Iceman, 5,000 years old. And I was going to talk about the 2 species of fungi that he had on his somewhat desiccated person. Canceled. I was supposed to do a fungal inventory in the Yukon, continued the one from last year, canceled. But my friend Helmut, who was the one who sent me the CD of the dogs howling, jokes. I'm mentioning this for a reason. He said, what you should do is show up at the Yukon border and say you're performing an essential service. You know, this is the key phrase now, essential service. And they will ask you what you're doing. You say, I have come here to document your fungi, the essential service. But one of the things I've noted, and this is, I suppose you could say, a significant conclusion to the event, in hanging out with Northern Native people, I have found that laughter in difficult times is the best medicine. I was in the Belcher Islands in Hudson Bay with an Inuk, and the wind was blowing furiously on the tent, and it collapsed. As I was feeding him coffee and whale meat, the tent collapsed on us, and I started cursing, and I heard from the other part of the tent nothing but riotous laughter. And another old man once told me, I said, what do you do when you run out of food? He said, well, there are 2 things we do. In the old days, we ate each other, thus finding more food. But when we didn't, we laughed, because the only way to deal with a difficult situation is laughter. When a small child falls on the ice in Greenland, its parents don't say, oh, poor thing, and pick it up. They burst into riotous laughter, and the child laughs too. And one of my informants was an elderly man who ended up being forced to go by a stroke to Copenhagen. He came back and was wheeled off the plane in a wheelchair. And the people who gathered to meet him burst into riotous laughter. They'd never seen a wheelchair before. And he burst into riotous laughter too. I think this should be translated to the pandemic.